Hello and welcome to another Wolftime gaming video. Today we are continuing in our Blood Bowl journey and we're going to be painting the Bogenhafen Barons. Obviously I'm not going to paint the whole team on camera, just going to pick a couple of the guys, but I'm going to use exactly the same technique for all of the miniatures that you can see on the screen now. Before we get started though, as usual, let's get that kettle on. Okay, so as usual, the first thing you want to do is give your miniatures a really good base coat. Obviously that's once they're built. Now in this instance you can tell that I've actually put some fine sand on the base before I've actually base coated them, and then I've gone at them with a rattle can of Games Workshop's grey cere and coated the whole mini. We can then start on the actual painting of the miniature itself. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is the face and the skin, but I wanted to do the eyes and get those out of the way. So the first step in that is to grab a little bit of black paint. In this instance, I'm using contrast black Templar, and all I'm doing is drawing a line from next to the nose to the edge of the eye. So you get in a black line, essentially, where the eye would be. And what this does is add a sort of shaded area around the eyeball. Now the next step is to start painting the actual eyeball itself. Now you can see I'm using a very fine tip brush to do this, but I'm doing exactly the same thing that I did with the black paint in the previous step, and all I'm doing is painting a white line, but this time I'm painting it within the black lines that I've already done. So you can see here I've just got the paintbrush there, and all I'm doing is painting a single line just to the center, and what this does is essentially create a shaded area with a white line in the middle, which is your eyeball. Now obviously we want to get the iris in there as well, and you can get a little bit clever with this and put this in different edges of the eye depending on which direction they're looking, or you can just go straight in at the center of that white line, and all you need to do is a dot, and just use black paint to do this. Don't worry about colors or anything like that, because you're not going to see from while he's on the tabletop. At the end of the day, you're going to be stood 2-3 feet away from these miniatures, and as long as they've got something in their in place of where their eyes would be, they look absolutely fantastic. Now we can move straight onto the skin, and I'm using contrast Gulliman's flesh for this. The reason I'm using contrast Gulliman's flesh is because it's so easy to use. You can just put it straight onto any areas of skin and it drops into those recesses really nicely, and looks absolutely fantastic without any sort of effort really. It's the easiest way I've found of painting skin anyway. We're then moving on to the next step, and because I wanted the uniform to be white and sort of a pinky purple shade, the same as Games Workshop's done it, I've gone straight in for an apothecary white contrast paint. Now what I'm doing is coating pretty much the entirety of the fabric on these miniatures. So I'm doing all around the legs, bottom of the legs, top of the legs, all their arms, any areas underneath their armor plating on their chest as well. You will know on this guy you've actually got the bit of fabric just poking out from the bottom next to his stomach, and I'm also sticking apothecary white all over the feathers as well, because a lot of these are going to have some form of white in them. We can then move on to the pink, because essentially we don't need to shade or highlight any of those white areas, and I'm using Screamer Pink to do this. Now what I'm doing with these miniatures is picking out certain areas of the trousers and the shirts in the pink colour. So in this instance I'm doing like the raised areas of and the inner areas I'm leaving white. On other miniatures that look, because you've obviously got two of each one, I'm doing the opposite, so I'll go with pink on the inside, white on the outside, and some of the legs I'm painting complete pink, some of the legs I'm leaving that apothecary white. Now what this does by using this technique is give you lots of variety within your team, so while it's keeping with the same colours, they all look a little bit different and look like they've actually gone out there and chose which uniform they want to put on, and everyone's slightly different. It's not like modern day football where everyone looks exactly the same. these guys will have maybe bought their own uniforms, they maybe had their own feathers on there. They've gone a little bit different, but generally the same colour schemes need to go on the miniatures throughout. To finish off the pink, I'm actually stealing an idea from Games Workshop and using a shade paint called Druchii Violet. That's spelled Druchii. Now, this is really nice. It's a nice sort of purple shade, and it really adds some depth to the pink, I've found. It drops into the recesses where you want it, but even on the raised areas, it makes it look more like fabric, and it's absolutely fantastic. So I definitely stole that idea because it really does finish off this sort of a pink colour, and it works really well. And while I've got that shade out, what I'm going to do is add a little bit to the tops of these feathers, just to add a little bit of interest. So a couple of the feathers I'm going with a white and this purple shade, and on other feathers I'm going with some browns. I think the purple really works well, and it's a very similar colour to the rest of the uniform, so it all sort of blends together quite nicely. I did think about going really bright and using reds and things like that, but I kind of pulled away from that, and I wanted the whole miniature to look like a complete uniform, so I wanted to go with similar colours. Now you will see that not all the fabric and not all the material on the miniature is the same. You've got this sort of Gambian underneath his armour plating. So what I've done with that is I'm going with a Xandri dust, and I'm going to pop a shade over the top of it in a little while. You see, I'll add a little bit of Agrax Earth shade that really works well, and it looks like more like what the knights would wear. So I really wanted to go with this sort of lighter colour or brown colour for the Gambian, rather than pinks and whites for the rest of the sort of sport uniform. Once the Xandri dust is on the model, then we can start on the actual armour plating itself. Now we're going with a gold colour for this, the same way as the Games Workshop and the Bogenhafen Barons have sort of been marketed to be. Now the gold I'm using is Retributor armour. If you've seen some of my other videos, you'll know I tend to go with Retributor armour for a lot of the golds, though I do have a few different ones. Now this is the colour I've used for my Custodes as well for Warhammer 40k. It's an absolutely fantastic paint and drops on really nicely and works really well when you add a shade to it. Now that's what I'm going to do in a little while, but first off I'm going to use another contrast paint called Contrast Wildwood to do all the straps and all the sort of leather work on the rest of the model. You've got quite a few of these. If you've stuck to sort of painting the armour plating and only painted the armour plating with the gold, you'll have the white bits left over, which are like all the straps and things like that under the arms, over the tops of the shoulders, around his waist. You can also paint the ball at this stage, and I'm going to use Contrast Wildwood for this, and then I'm going to put a lighter colour on that so it stands out from his catcher's glove or thrower's glove. Which are also exactly the same colour. Now you will find with this contrast paint in particular, I've found it does pull away from some of the raised areas quite a lot, so you need to just go around while the paint's still a little bit wet, just to add a little bit more if you haven't put enough onto the mini. I'm also going to paint his hair at this stage as well, because it's kind of a catch-all, this Contrast Wildwood is, and works quite well, but make sure you do use a very small bristled brush to actually paint around the beard and his sort of moustache, because you don't want to go over the top of the skin that you've done with that other contrast paint a little bit earlier. Now the leatherwork's complete. There's some of the buckles and strap and bits holding the straps together essentially, and I'm going to use a silver paint called Lead Belcher just to pick out that detail, because I wanted them to look a little bit different. I don't think that the leather buckles and things would really work with these. They're quite ornate. You've got this very gold armour. It's quite bright. They wouldn't be using leather to actually hold it together, so adding the silver paint works quite well. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I'm painting the ball a slightly different colour, and I've grabbed Mournfang Brown. If you've seen my other Blood Bowl videos, you'll know that this is one I've used in conjunction with the Wildwood before, and it works really well. It's a really nice bright brown colour and goes on over the top of the Contrast Wildwood really nicely. And you can also pick out a few straps and bits and pieces if you want to do that at the same time with that, just to add a little bit of difference, especially around the gloves. There's a couple of straps just around the gloves. You can add a little bit of Mournfang Brown just to add a few different variants of brown colours to add a little bit more to the model if you want to, but you don't obviously need to. Now to paint his trainers and shoes, there's a lot of metal work on the Bogenhafen Barons boots. So I'm going with a black paint and I'm using contrast wildwood, contrast black Templar to do this, because it essentially pulls away from the raised areas quite nicely and adds that sort of a grey, sort of worn look to it, so it looks a little bit more like fabric as well, and I think it works really, really well. Just to on some of the miniatures, you do have like a kind of a purity seal type thing as well. Now he's on this one in comparison to the other. He wasn't on the other, obviously, but on this one he's got one just on underneath the left arm. Now, you could do anything with this, really, any sort of colour, but I wanted to go with a real wax feel, so I've used a contrast paint called Blood Angels Red to actually paint that, just to add that little bit more to the model and make it look a little bit more realistic, I suppose, having that sort of wax sort of seal just underneath his left arm. You can also see on this model now the plumes I was talking about, doing the browns earlier, when at the same time as doing some of the straps and things like that, I painted the brown feathers on the top of his head as well, which worked really, really nicely and added a lot of detail to the actual miniature that kind of wasn't there already. I could have gone with, you know, a lot of the same colour, but adding this brown I think makes it stand out quite nicely from the white. Now to move on to the next step, it's quite a small detail. I'm using this sort of calligraphy style pen to actually put a name onto the front. You've got that sort of lighter coloured Xandri dust area that I painted a little bit earlier when I did the rest of the sort of Gambian. So just pick some sort of traditional names. I've gone with Eric and John for these two particular models, and as you can see, essentially I'm just writing on there with this pen rather than using a brush, because I do find that when you use a brush to do writing, it doesn't quite work well, and it doesn't work for me anyway. Now we're adding some of the shading onto the model. I'm going with Agrax Earthshade to start with, and covering all that Xandri dust we talked about earlier on that Gambian, and I can also do that area on his chest as well that we've just put his name on, because it's the same sort of colour and it works quite well, quite nicely. Once you've got that on there, if you sort of put this on first and then try to write the name on after and made a mistake, it's quite difficult to get that colour back. I've also painted the ball at this stage with Agrax Earthshade as well, because I do find that it blends it all together quite nicely. The miniature's almost complete now. We're getting pretty close. He's looking really, really good, but he's still I'm still wanting to add that little bit more to it. So I've grabbed a little bit of Null Oil just to drop it onto these silver areas, so they blend really nicely. Because I did find that the lead belcher paint did shine very, very brightly, and I just wanted to pull that down a little bit and make it a little bit darker, and blend it into the belts and the straps quite nicely. And across all the models you want to do this as well, because these bits do stand out quite prominently, but they look a little bit more natural once you've got that Null Oil on there, or at least I've found that anyway. Now the other area that we haven't actually put any shade on is the armour, and that's really, really important, because we want to put something on there, because at the moment it was a very sort of flat gold colour. Now I'm using Reichland Flesh Shade Gloss to do this one, which is the same paint that Games Workshop used for their ones as well. Because I do think it works really, really well. I think it drops into the recesses really nicely, especially around the knee pads and where there's joins in the different parts of the armour. It sinks into that recess really, really well and adds a lot of detail essentially to the model. I do find that shades work fantastically when working with things this small. So we're at the stage now where the paint on the actual miniature is completed, so we want to do the base. Now I'm using a brown paint called Rhinoxide to actually paint the base. Now usually what I do with miniatures is add a little bit of a lighter browns, maybe some Xandri dust in a dry brush, that sort of thing, to this soiled area, so it adds a lot of sort of depth to the actual soil. You don't need to do that though, and I'm not doing it in this instance because I'm going to be popping some static grass over the whole thing, like you would find on, you know, maybe one of the pitches in the Empire or in Bretonia, where you'd have some nice lush green pictures there. Now around the base you could have gone with could go with the continuation of that brown onto the base, but I like to frame my models. If you've seen some of my videos you'll know it's something that I do with everything. I always put a black paint around. If you use the contrast paints you will have to use a couple of coats. Now to add the static grass on, all I'm doing first is popping a little bit of PVA glue. This is standard sort of PVA glue you can pick up anywhere, any sort of hobby shop sells this, and adding the static grass on with some tweezers. You'll know I'm not using an applicator for this because I didn't want it too neat. I wanted it to look a little bit messy because it is a pitch at the end of the day and people have been running around on it, and you know they haven't got these mowers that they've got in modern day sport, have they? And that's it. The model is complete. I think they look absolutely fantastic. You can, if you want to, add some white stripes to the basing to add a little bit more to them, but I think the models pop really nice from those black bases with the green, and you've got this purple and white. I really love the white. I was never a fan of painting white before, but I think that it works really well. Now they've gone with this contrast sort of colours. Adding the apothecary white is absolutely fantastic and pretty much does all the work for you. I do find by using these contrast paints accompanied by the shades when you have to use some of the base coats, I think they work really well and allow you to get, you know, miniatures of this sort of a quality on the table really quickly, you know, with very minimal effort. Not much effort from my part. Some of the hairs I've done differently. You'll see, you know, got some blonde hair, some browns and different colours. Just use different things dependent on how you feel, really, what you want to do. You can use some of the wildwood, you can use some Xandri dust, you know, you could use some of the Mornfang brown even and then add a shade on, and it all works really well and looks fantastic when it's completed. But thanks for coming along to the channel and watching my video. Please do take a moment to subscribe. Let me know what you think in the comments down below as well. See if you want to see any of the other teams and things. I might attempt some of the Seraphon or Lizard Men in the future. But otherwise, I'll see you in the next one.